Coming up, a legacy episode. Is Kyrie Irving on the path to the Hall of Fame, or has he, over the last couple of seasons, maybe 3 or 4, derailed the narrative around one of the best basketball talents in NBA history? We discuss right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, yes, friends. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings, DraftKings, FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and let you know, today's episode is going to be brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. And before we dive in, Doug, coming to you live from the Coast Guard Barracks, how are we, sir, on a holiday weekend?
You can see from the background on YouTube, I'm on location here, pal. The holiday weekend went off the rails. I had the best intentions. I had all my gear packed up, and then I was told we were going to be back early. And then I don't want to break the news to everyone here. That didn't happen. So now
didn't make it.
Yeah, we're visiting friends for the weekend, and now I'm doing it on a different location that I was not on, a different mic, a different setup. So if everything looks a little different on YouTube, that's the reason. It's okay. Content remains A+. So that's all that really ends up mattering. Yeah, excited to talk about Kyrie today because I do feel like this is going to be this is probably just going to be the major talking point for net stuff over the course of the offseason. I mean, we'll get draft and we'll get like all that other stuff and free agent signings, but the Kyrie thing, like the way it's trending is clearly not going to be the last time we talk about this, but it's just becoming an even bigger story, even though there's like sometimes a lack of movement, I think, on both fronts.
Yeah, and you and I talked about when we're doing our pre-show, figuring out what we're going to discuss. Like, this does feel like the next layer after, what does the season look like? What does the off season look like? What does the next few years look like for Kyrie? What does his career look like? Said it at the top, but ultimately this is about, as you'll see in the title, will these next few years with the Brooklyn Nets define Kyrie Irving's career, right? Because it's nuts, man, to think about a player of his talent that has won an NBA championship and yet is now 5 years removed from what feels like universal praise and joy and excitement for his game, the way so many other elite NBA talents are basically treated, unless things are really going off the rails or you're trapped on a bad team somewhere. Kyrie's always been in a position to be playing high-level basketball, meaningful games for important teams in the NBA.
Yeah, it's just really, it's kind of, from a narrative perspective, it's kind of gone off the rails for him since he left Cleveland, right? Like and all this stuff, it's so funny because all the stuff we're going to talk about with Kyrie is going to be nothing having to do with his talent, right? Like the talent is pretty much set. Like we know what the talent is. He's among the most talented players ever to play basketball. I don't think that is a question at all. I think the stats when he plays, and that's going to be the operative piece here, like clearly back it up around what he brings when he's on the court. But really kind of since he left Cleveland, it's been one thing after another in terms of stories. And it's now spiraling a little bit in terms of his legacy talk, Yeah. And that's what becomes a big talking point among the NBA. But really, from the time that he leaves, that he asks out of Cleveland to be traded and gets traded to the Celtics for that Isaiah Thomas deal, it just has not really gone well. And we'll get into some of the specifics around it, some of the stats and some of the accolades that he's gotten over the years. But it's now to a point where Nike, there's rumors that Nike wants to distance the relationship with him, and he's got a very popular shoe brand, and even they're kind of maybe wanting to pump the brakes. We heard what what Christian Winfield has reported when it came to the Nets front office. There's just been a lot of little pieces now that really start making you wonder what the future holds for this guy. It's we're at a really weird crossroads for his career.
And it's funny too, because you mentioned Cleveland, which is obviously the tipping point for where he was from a narrative standpoint to where he is today. But then, you don't have to look too far into the NBA playoffs to see the team that he also was on in the Boston Celtics and wonder, remember, that's where he said, if you'll have me back, guys, I'd love to be here.
Yeah.
what could it have looked like over the last few seasons had he actually been in Boston? Presumably, at least with Tatum and Brown and however else maybe they constructed that could look a little bit different, but a very strong team, obviously deep in deep in a playoff run. I think in some ways that's what makes it's fascinating because his decisions, and I'm not a referendum on him as an individual, but it seems like he's made the wrong choice at every turn, right? I want to have my own team. I want to be in control. Well, when you look back, you think, boy, if you could have hung on, not that and everyone knew it then, if you could have stuck around with LeBron James, you probably could have won some more championships. Okay, you want to have your own squad. You go to Boston, and now you see with the way Tatum's developed and Jaylen Brown and just the stability of that organization, it looks like you could have at least been winning a ton of basketball games and going forward there. Then ultimately, from a Brooklyn Nets standpoint, you benefit from him choosing to come here. It gets the Nets and the Nets fan base Kevin Durant, but this isn't the off the court thing. Even this is all on the court stuff. It just hasn't been there. Like the success has not been there for him. And if I think back, am I right? In the Boston time ended with him in a ball dominant game, elimination game where he wanted to play hero ball. That was the end of that narrative in Boston. He wanted to be the man that did it. He couldn't do it, and then ultimately exited after unceremoniously saying he wanted to be there.
Yeah, look, I never blame players for being like, "Hey, I'm going to sign here and then go and do something else." It's
Yeah,
just the nature of the business. Other opportunities come up, like it looks like a better situation. You want to go play with Durant. Like I would never hold that against him to say he was going to resign and then something better. And anybody in the world would say something and then have a better situation come up and be like, "Oh, never mind. I've changed my mind. I have new information around this." Right. So that part of it, doesn't really, matter to me that much. But if you just look at what has happened from him since he left Cleveland, some of so it's funny. His actual stats are awesome. Like his on-court
per game
stuff
stats, right?
His per game, per season, like per regular season stats are phenomenal. And they actually even get better when he's coming to the Nets. Like he's had, from a statistical standpoint, 3 pretty amazing seasons when he's played on the court. But if you look at some of the stuff for him, like he's played 103 total games in 3 seasons for the Nets, right? Like that's not enough. And yes, there's reasons around it. Yes, he got injured. Yes, he walked away from the team at one point. The COVID piece, like the vaccine piece, obviously was a huge piece of this. Like there's lots of different reasons. They still all happens, right? And he's played a total of 103 games. And for the Nets, he's played 13 total playoff games for the Nets since he came. He's actually only played, this is crazy, he's only played 22 playoff games since he left Cleveland. 22 total playoff games in the 5 seasons. Yeah. In the 5 seasons since he left Cleveland. That's nothing. That's like, well, it's basically, don't have to do the averages here. That's basically one round of playoff games, like getting one sweep a year and being swept out of the playoffs. Like it was what that basically averages out to. And so you just look at that and you're like, wow, he just hasn't played. Like he just hasn't played that much. He hasn't played really many high quality, meaningful games. I get it. He twisted his ankle when Giannis, undercut him last year, but he just hasn't played. Like, I don't know what you do with situations like this and how you evaluate them when you just don't have enough track record to know and feel confident that it's just going to change. Like, I think that's the biggest thing. Maybe even the frustration Nets folks feel too.
Yeah, and he's going to listen, and he is going to be 30 years old, right? So I think the difference now is too, like because I was going back and looking at the 2 years in Boston and realizing, well, his first year he only plays 60 games, but the second year he plays 67. So that's that's on par with getting some scheduled rest, etc. But as we said before in his career, you go back to 15, 16, and it's 53, 72, then 60, 67 with his time in Boston. So there always is this down dip, whether it's from injury, etc., that he misses. And early in a career, it probably doesn't matter as much. But when we're talking about will it be defined by his time in Brooklyn? Will his entire career? Well, probably, because now at 30 years old, even just from the injury standpoint, he always has a couple of little things that do come up. And I wonder in the way, listen, the league is a far less physical league, but he plays a position. We know he tries to avoid contact, but it's only going to take 1 or 2 more injuries over the next few years that cost you 20 to 30 games. And when do they come? At what points of the season that can continue to put you on this now 4 or 5, 6 year run of saying, I don't know. I don't know what Kyrie is capable of, not from a talent standpoint, from an availability on the court standpoint.
Yeah, and I think I think that's always going to be sort of like the guillotine hanging over like everyone's neck, right? When it comes to whether he's going to play, it's just like the question of is he going to play? Like, and we'll talk here in a second too about I want to talk a little bit like about Hall of Fame stuff too, because
Yep.
I think like when we talk about a guy of Kyrie's talent, like you have to discuss these. You have to start putting him in like where he lands in the context of like the greatest players ever, because I think that question becomes really, really interesting too. So we'll talk about Hall of Fame stuff. We'll talk some more about that Christian Winfield reporting as well. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Bet Online. Bet Online continues to be the number one source for all of your betting needs, all of your sports info. They got everything over at Bet Online. I'm over there every single day looking at the baseball lines, the money lines, the over-unders, like rolling you through the playoffs as we get, by the time you hear this, we'll know who's going to be in the championship. They got the fights on the weekends too, NFL futures. It's all there for you on Bet Online, your number one source for all your sports wagering information. They have live betting as well, so go check that out. Go head on over to betonline.net. Over on your mobile device, you can learn all about the trends and the action. Bet Online, where the game starts.
Yeah, and of course, how about Jimmy Butler, little 47, just hanging out there, making it happen for Miami after everyone was like, "Hey, can't wait to see Boston in the finals." Am I right, guys? I was like, well, listen, something. By the way, we talked about him too, right? Here's a guy that is dragging his body across the court and trying to will his team to success. But to your point around now, the question extends to what are you going to define over the next few years? Not only your legacy from a championship standpoint, obviously for Kyrie Irving, but also when we look at the Hall of Fame and whether or not he can be considered at this point of his career and projecting forward someone that would be a lock. And typically, guys of his talent, when you look over the course of the first 10 years of their career, 10 plus years, you're going to go, oh, yeah, this talent, what he's accomplished, he's on the path for that. But I'll kick it off with this little nugget around points, because that's obviously a big factor that comes into it. You're gonna give the disclaimer for yourself. I'll do it for the both of us. We are not Hall of Fame credential experts, so there's a lot of things that go into that. It's beyond just the straight numbers. We get that, but for a guy in Kyrie Irving, where do you think he ranks all time right now in this moment for total points scored in the NBA?
Where does he rank like overall? You said like
Yeah, what's his
in
position?
history? Oh man, I don't know. Is he can't be in the top 100, right? Like
177 right
yeah.
now. And you can put that up against all the other guys that you would think of that are currently playing in the NBA that you consider to be among the best. They're all in the upper 30, right? Like they're all miles ahead of him. And the biggest discrepancy that you show around this and why Kyrie Irving is such a talented player, and yet he's held himself back, or he's been held back from injury in a lot of circumstances. It's taken him just 611 games to amass just over 14,000 points. He's at position 177. At 169 is Kevin Love, who has 14,300 points, and it's taken him 200 more games.
Yeah.
Nobody around him is anywhere basically in that range of having played just 600 games to amass that point. So it's not about, as we know, it's not the production of it. It's just playing the games to be productive like that. And Kevin Love, they're on the same exact timeline, but Kevin Love has missed a ton of time in his career and has managed to amass 800 games and 14,000 plus points.
Yeah, and this actually, it's funny too, because not like we are all about counting stats here, but that stat is it actually kind of just tells the whole story, right? Like that stat almost among itself tells the whole story about like, yeah, it hasn't taken him very long to get to the amount of points. It's just that if he had just played sort of a regular amount of games for his career like that, like he'd be so much higher. It would be a no-brainer, right? Like around what the exact thing. It's really funny about stuff like that, because you sometimes see this with baseball too. Like Mike Trout is like this. It's like Mike Trout's like career has gone like his like per game stuff is like almost unmatched, right? But he just like has struggled sometimes to stay healthy for the whole time. And like, so like you look at WAR and all this other stuff, it's like, oh my God, like if he had just been completely healthy this whole time, he would be, he's probably a Hall of Famer already, but like just using it to compare something you just need to be on the court enough, right? You need to play enough. So his per game stuff, his per season stuff is absolutely amazing. Can he get 6 more years of that production where he just plays a full season? Like then it's a no brainer, right? Like then it's like, I don't think but it's crazy that we're even asking ourselves this question.
Yeah, he would need to have 4 or 5. His average in good years is 1,400 to 1,600 points a season. He needs 4 or 5 years of that in order to get himself into that upper echelon area, which is obviously achievable from a talent standpoint. And just a couple other things to throw out here. A guy like Mike Conley has played 960 games almost for that same point total, which kind of makes sense if you think about him. He's had some injuries too. But a really good comp, I think, and a guy that probably Wizards fans would ask the same question of, Bradley Beal. 645 games, just over 14,000 points. Another guy that's had a lot of injuries in his career, right? Missed a lot of time. The talent is elite. But as you get to the back end, now he hasn't won a championship like Kyrie, but you end up at this point where you're like, yeah, you've been around, you're amassing stats, but are you doing it when it matters most? And I think the playoff one that you mentioned there in the first segment too is like the big piece. You're not on the biggest stage to make the biggest plays, because I think that's the intangible factor around Hall of Fame status. What do you do when the games matter most? And Kyrie just hasn't been there to have those opportunities.
And when you look at accolades too, because like the other way to look at this too is like, how are you compared to your peers, right? We know what the points are. The points on a per game basis are almost unmatched. Again, to reiterate for the 9 millionth time, it's just because he doesn't play enough that it's not there, but then, or that it doesn't climb all the way up the charts. And then if you look at the accolades, he's been to this All-Star game 7 times. That's great. Never made an NBA all NBA first team, which I thought was pretty interesting. He's made NBA all NBA second team once and third team twice. And you would think too, like again, around his talent, it would feel like that number should be higher, right? Like when you think about his talent and when you think about like his overall talent and how great he is and how, beautiful it is to watch him play, basically since he came into the league, right? You would think that some of those accolades, like never really been in the conversation for MVP, obviously. Some of that's just going to be who you're up. Like, when you're when you share a career with Kevin Durant and excuse me, and LeBron James, guys like this, it's going to be hard to get MVP votes. So I can't blame him that much. But the All NBA stuff, like that's not that many All NBA mentions, right? Mm-hmm. Like he's randomly got a third team All NBA vote this year from Jalen Rose, who I feel like maybe misclicked the voting thing, but
they had a column and the name, and it wasn't. It's fine.
But yeah, like, when he comes in as the rookie of the year and it's looking great, and obviously what he did in the finals, but as compared to his peers over the course of his career, those accolades don't really start piling up either. And so it's kind of a double. And again, I think most of that is because of just the lack of playing. Like if he plays this whole season, like he did, if he played the whole season this year at these numbers, it's like a kind of a lock that he would be on these lists. Right. But like, it's just like, because he made second team All NBA, or he made third team All NBA last year, basically doing this. So I think like he would clearly have just been on there again, but he just you couldn't vote for him because he just didn't play enough.
Well, and how about the fact too? Like it's like I'll give a great player comparison that used to be on the Brooklyn Nets and James Harden, right? He hasn't won a championship, but I think by the numbers, when you're talking about Hall of Fame, you go, oh, he'll be a Hall of Famer because
he's a lock. He's a lock,
right? Because he's amassing these statistical categories, and not even in a Russell Westbrook picking up triple doubles in the new version of the NBA. Like this is a guy who's been an elite scorer season in, season out, and durability has always been a big factor for him, obviously. But it's funny, he has a couple more years.
Real quick, just two of those guys. I mean, those guys just won MVPs too. You know what I mean? Right. Like it's just like they have this other sort of like lamppost thing that you can point at as a light and say, hey, like they also just did this other thing. Yeah, was some of it compiling, and was some of it like the way the teams ran their offenses to just make sure they could just compile as many stats as possible. Yeah, I get it. Like they definitely did that. But they weren't going to be worse than like third any of those seasons, right? That they won. So it's not, it's the conversation is just totally different around those guys. And maybe you say, okay, Kyrie's never wanted to play a game like that, and he's never kind of wanted to do those things. I can hear that. But if you're just comparing it to those other point guards of a generation, like those guys are just going to have things that Kyrie doesn't have.
Yeah, and it just, I don't know, it makes it fascinating. And the other thing that then comes into it here too, we'll talk about in a second, is we these next few years. And I wonder if coming off of, I talked about him on a couple episodes ago by myself. I asked Antonio Daniels, which was a great conversation I had with him the other day about like, the max contract and should they give it to him? Is he worth it? And should Kyrie Irving be self-aware around this? Which I was actually surprised by Antonio Daniels' response. We'll break that down and then ask the question, what is the best move for Kyrie to maybe correct his Hall of Fame legacy path here as he moves forward over the back end of potentially, I guess, still could have a decade left here, but how do you make the most out of the back end of your career if you are Kyrie Irving? First, we're going to tell you, of course, that if you've made the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen, thank you. It's free on all those great platforms. Also free on all those great platforms. Give me the Locked On NBA Big Board. It's host Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter. He's breaking down all the prospects, seeing where everyone's going, trades, moves, and just what's going to happen when it comes to NBA Draft Night. You can check him out on, of course, the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast, free, as I say, on all those platforms. So this is the interesting thing too. I mentioned Antonio Daniels. I asked him the question, and I thought from he took it from both a player and from a organization perspective. If if the organization says we can't give you the max deal on the max number of years possible because there just isn't trust there, The biggest takeaway I had was that Antonio Daniel said, and Kyrie Irving needs to have a level of self-awareness around that. Like he needs to come to the table understanding what he's responsible for, and maybe it ends up being a multi-year deal instead of 2 instead of 4, let's say. But is being in Brooklyn Kyrie Irving's best bet if he's worried about his legacy and Hall of Fame and
Yeah.
championships? Is he maybe better off walking away and maybe being the gun for hire for a few seasons here and just grabbing on with organizations that need a guy? Doesn't have to be the number one, but needs to show up and do what he can do offensively for a team to help him get over the hump.
Yeah, I mean, I think okay, so let me just clarify this with two things. One, I think he's going to be back as a net. Like I think that in one fashion or another, I think he's just is going to be back playing with Brooklyn because I think that's just the easiest path for all parties, right? Like even I think some of this is just grandstanding around negotiations, and I think that when it's all said and done, they're going to realize that they all kind of need each other, right? Like they're not because they can't really replace him. I don't think the market's going to be out there for him in a way that maybe he thinks it will be. So I think he's just going to be back. And then your second question around, is this his best chance? I think this very easily, like, I think frankly, I think one season of just playing the whole season and the team, they don't even need to win the championship, like getting through the first round or something like that. I think that would reset it. Like, I don't think it's going to take much here. And I think he clearly has the opportunity to do it. It's not a talent thing. If he can just get like 65 games of him and Durant basically playing together and and he gets anything out of Simmons and they get through the first round and it looks good. And nothing happens this season. Like there's no controversy. There's no weird quotes. There's no walking away from the team. There's no random other, there's a new pandemic where you got to get a new thing, like as long as we can avoid those, as long as we can avoid those kinds of situations, I actually think it resets really, really quickly. Like I don't think it would take much. And so I'm taking the long way to answer. Yes, I do think this is the best chance because the best chance would be to go to have it be awesome for a whole season where it's been a little weird and just be like, hey, no, we're getting this thing right in the right track. Like not to go somewhere new and reset it. Like, no, do it in the place where you want it to be, where people want you, and just have it just be a regular season. I think that would go so far.
Well, it's so funny too. I think I agree with you on that point of it only takes one. It only takes
Yes.
one normal season. It only takes seeing him, seeing the Nets with him and Kevin Durant in the playoffs being productive, right? Like right now, the last version that we saw of this team is Kevin Durant and Kyrie being on the court, which I think furthers the disconnect around what's possible for them because they just got swept and they didn't look,
Yeah.
and they both took games where you weren't necessarily sure that they were wholly invested in the process, kind of maybe just staring down, knowing we're not getting out of this. This isn't going to be the postseason that we were hoping for. So it leaves a bad taste there. But as quickly as narratives build up around players in the NBA, is how quickly they can be turned around. We've
Yes.
talked before on the podcast about Chris Paul. He's this dead asset. You're never going to be able to make anything of him. Goes to Phoenix, and now all of a sudden he's having the best back end of his career, that better than
Great
anyone could have
comparison.
expected. Yeah,
That's a great comparison. Yeah. Like that's a really good comp for like how it doesn't take much to shift it, right? Like it doesn't take much to all of a sudden. And like, look, Chris Paul just got, a terrible game 7. So that's the only reason that's not a good comp, but overall it's a good comp because it's like,
think about James Harden, right? He goes from
Yep.
being a guy that everyone looks as an elite high-level talent in Houston, and he's wasting away the back end of his career. He forces his way out. People kind of give him a pass coming out of Houston, understanding what wasn't happening there. Comes to Brooklyn. The first year of the sample is, hey, man, this dude is electric. And now he's carrying the team. Can you believe it?
He was like an MVP.
Season,
Right. He was basically like he was MVP, like MVP caliber season, and then we saw where
cut
that
to
went.
the wheels fall off, and he forces his way out of there, and he goes to Philly, and now maybe things don't look as bright for him going forward. But that was over a 2-year stretch. A guy went from the highest and the lowest, and maybe back to somewhere in the middle ground. So that narratives do change, and absence can either make the heart grow fonder, as the saying goes, or it can make the mind drift on what this is. What is Kyrie Irving? And to your point, well, even the Boston 2 years, 60 and 67 games. If you did that over the next 2 seasons in Brooklyn, I think the production on the court would be there. The opportunities to be successful would be there.
Oh, totally.
And then we'll have, though, I think, over the next 2 or 3 seasons, a much clearer picture of what has Kyrie been these last couple of years, and what does that look like for him then at 34, 35, 36.
Totally. And that's why, it goes back to our original question is this time in the Nets going to define his legacy. It definitely is going to. This is going to make or break it right here, I think. And like I said, I think he's going to be back. I think it's going to be something like, I don't even think it'll be something like a 3-year deal or something like that, right? Like that's my guess. If it'll be something like a 3-year deal, not a max. Everyone, all parties kind of come in and say like, this is what needs to happen. We need you to give a little. There's not going to be anything around like playing time. Like, you're not going to have to. I don't think they'll get stuff like that into the contract because it's like outside of the CBA. So I think we can like basically not even guarantee stuff like that's going to happen. But I think it'll just be something like that, and it'll be a 2 to 3 year window where we will know at the end of that, like very clearly where he stands.
Do you think, because it kind of dovetails into this, I had broken down the Christian Winfield article and some of the talking points there, and I
Yep.
think that there's logic on both sides of it. That it makes sense for Brooklyn to be approaching it this way. It makes sense that Kyrie's drawing a line in the sand. There's a lot of leverage on Kyrie's side, just from a walk away standpoint into free
Totally.
agency, and the Nets would effectively get nothing for him.
He has
But
more, just real quick, he has more leverage than the Nets do, like for sure. Even with all this other stuff, it's more important. The Nets need him more than he needs them, I think.
Okay. So you know what? Then let's because this ties.
Sorry
into
to
Kyrie.
interrupt your other point, but like I was just
No, no.
yeah.
But this speaks to it, because the one thing on the yes, Kyrie has more leverage, short of saying if Kyrie Irving is about getting the maximum dollars right now, then it's the sign and trade where Brooklyn
Yep.
can give him that money, and then he can also go play somewhere else. And one of the bullet points in the Christian Winfield article was, hey, if you're Kyrie, from his leverage side, I can just walk into free agency, go sign somewhere. I wait until December. That team can then move me, because there's only 5 teams that could afford to give him the money, even on a
Yep.
short-term deal, and then turn to flip him to another team, get him to his ultimate destination. But from a net standpoint, you could say, hey, if you definitely don't want to be here and you want the max dollars, which we are the team that can give you that, then we can make this happen. There's probably a level of, disinterest and spite that would happen justifiably from Kyrie. Who'd say, I'm not going to give you
Right.
guys any value on me. And what is the trickle down effect with Kevin Durant, et cetera, right? So like those pieces are a factor there. But the question I really want to get to with you is, do you think, because this is what I was pondering, the Brooklyn Nets and bringing back Kyrie Irving, do they have to take the long look and say, if we bring back Kyrie Irving and we have this possibility of Ben Simmons, we know we have Kevin Durant, where do they see themselves in the NBA Eastern Conference hierarchy? That's the biggest question to me, because if you're going to commit to Kyrie, you should be committing to him because you believe the championship window will be open over the next few seasons. If you quietly, not to the public, feel like, hey, even with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant and Ben Simmons, best version of Ben Simmons, we're still going to have a heck of a road battling our way through the Eastern Conference. I get it. You take your chances. But if you don't think it's a X% lock, then I get the logic of saying maybe we want to get off this train a little bit sooner, knowing that the ultimate goal may not be achievable.
Yeah, I just think you have to, even if you're kidding, it's real funny. Even if you're kidding yourselves, you have to just view this team as championship, like a championship.
That's what I mean, right? Are you just going like, put on the goggles, baby? Like show me a 10.
You have to.
Show me a 10 at the end of the night.
Because you have to, because there's no other way around it. Like you have Kevin Durant, like that window is going to close over the next couple years. He's still a top, I mean, God, at worst 4 player in the NBA, like something like that, depending on where you kind of value him. And that's like, I think at worst, as long as you have that talent, you just have to, even if you're kidding yourselves, you have to talk yourself into like trying to go for it all, because you can't hit a reset button. So that's pointless. There's no way the guys that you have now, you're not getting off. Like you're kind of going to have Simmons here for probably a while, right? Like you have enough talent here and you're not kidding yourselves either too. Like these guys, if they all play at peak, this is a championship level team. Like, so, and with a few other pieces added to it, you get Harris back healthy, you can maybe get one other wing, you bring back Claxton. Like that's a team that can win the championship. I'm dead serious about that. So I don't think you're kidding yourselves either. But even if you were kidding yourselves a little bit, you still have to just, like you said, put the goggles on, because there's no other way to do it. And then you just need to give fans the best effort every single season. And this is actually why I said before with Kyrie, it's funny. Like I don't even think winning the championship for him specifically would make a difference. Like I think, like I said, play a lot, get maybe go game 6 or game 7 in the second round with a good team and lose, and like even that I think would be fine.
Like, just be in a conversation in the NBA playoffs for a few seasons. That's what it takes to kind of cement yourself, I think, in that echelon of players, right? You just have to be there with the opportunities. As long as you're doing that, the rest of it I think takes care of itself a little bit in the background for sure.
And I think too, look, and we'll close out on this. All this goes back to say, on a talent level, this guy is among the best ever to do it. Like this is not like, I'm just going to put a pin on this by saying it's never about the talent. Like it's frankly, the only reason it gets frustrating is because he's so talented.
Right. I
Like,
wish it wasn't so good.
right. Like we don't have this conversation around, right. We don't have this conversation around like, oh, it's just like some random, like we're not talking about it with some random other point guard out there. Like, we're just, because that just aren't as talented as him. Like the only reason this stuff comes up in conversation, the only reason it gets frustrating is because he's so good. And so like, and then when that becomes the case, it's like, you just want to see the best that he has for a long sustained period, because you know that level of play can get you like close to a championship, right? Like when paired with their other things. So that's the only reason it ever becomes frustrating. All right, we're going to get out of
Real
here.
Quick.
Oh God. Yeah.
Tease for an upcoming episode for us, because while the Nets may not be making any big swings in free agency, a lot of fans asking for Zach LaVine, etc., there is a conversation to be had about how Brooklyn can benefit from big player names moving from one roster to the other. Depth chart, maybe there's some trade exemption options out there for Brooklyn to improve this team around Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, and Ben Simmons.
Nothing gets Adam more excited than draft and trade exemptions. So like, as long as we can start those two, we can feather in those two conversations. We are good to go for an offseason. All right. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. We really appreciate it. I know this is a holiday, so if you're checking in on Monday, hope that you all enjoyed the holiday. Make sure you just hit subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast. Free and available on all platforms, YouTube as well. Yeah, that's it. Those are the two ways you help the podcast.
Hey, listen, talent is cheaper than table salt. What separates the talented individual from the successful individual is a lot of hard work. Stevie King.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets, the horror kind. We will be back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.